Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's Baker-Nord lecture. The theme of the Baker-Nord programming this year, as many of you know, is revolution. And it sounds like there's a revolution going on out in the hallway there. No, it's not yet. And revolution not just in the sense of a political upheaval, but any kind of major change, any kind of shift of thought, of action in science, the arts. And last week, we had Marjorie Garber speak about Occupy Shakespeare. Next week, after semester break, J.B. Schenck from the University of Minnesota, who was our scholar in residence this semester, will be talking about Galileo and the scientific revolution. And then for today, we're into a completely different area. But first, I have a thank you to make, because the funding for today's lecture comes from the residents of Cuyahoga County. That from the Baker-Nord Center received a significant grant from the Cuyahoga County Arts and Culture. And this funding is very different from the rest of the grants that were received. There's a distinction here that this comes from the people of Cuyahoga County who voted in 2006 to provide funding from the county for the arts and cultural events that they attend. And so this is Baker-Nord saying thank you to you for your support. And this afternoon's speaker, American literary theorist Walter Benn Michaels, is a professor of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Named, quote, one of the most influential Americanists of his generation by the Chronicle of Higher Education, he is the author of numerous books, including Our America, Nativism, Modernism, and Pluralism, and The Shape of the Signifier, 1967 to the End of History. Michaels has written numerous essays and articles and has contributed to the New York Times Magazine and the Boston Globe. Michaels earned his BA in 1970 and a PhD in 1975 from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He taught at Johns Hopkins University and the University of California, Berkeley, before going to the University of Illinois at Chicago's Department of English in 2001. He was head of that department from 2001 to 2007. Please join me in welcoming Walter Benn Michaels.
Thank you. So thank you. I'm talking, I guess there are two microphones. Can you hear me alone with this one? Yeah, okay. I'm terrible with microphones, but worse without them, so I'm doing what I can. Every time I'm introduced, I always realize I should put something on my Vita that I haven't, because it would make the introduction so much more interesting. I am, as far as I know, the only literary critic, theorist, historian, or anything else to ever have been interviewed in Hustler magazine with a full-page color photograph. When they told me they wanted the photograph, they made a point of saying, well, we want you to keep your clothes on, Professor. So it's like it's cool in this, but it never comes up somehow. And every time I get introduced, I think I should have put that in. It would have helped the introducer. You could sort of build a kind of line around it. So I'm actually going to talk today a bit about actual revolution, as I'm not interested in metaphoric revolutions exactly. Although that's actually an exaggeration. It isn't as revolutionary as I would like. The talk is about, originally the talk was going to be about a series of photographs and text, but it's a relatively short time. I had a thing about Faulkner. If there's a time and discussion, we can talk about Faulkner, but I'm just leaving Faulkner out in favor of the things I can show you. So I'm going to talk mainly about photographs by Walker Evans and the great German photographer August Sander. And the kind of reason the talk is called Revolutionaries is because, in a way, the fulcrum for the talk is a photograph by Sander, which is just called Revolutionaries, which you will see sort of about halfway through this. Okay? All right, so the first thing, this is the core of this begins with Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, A.G. and Evans' great text from 1940, although they did most of the work on it in 1936. The first encounter narrated in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men between James A.G. and Walker Evans and two white men, landowners, one of whom agrees to let them, is between A.G. and Evans and two white men who are landowners, one of whom agrees to let them come to his land to take pictures. What's slightly strange about this beginning is why A.G. and Evans want to go, since A.G. knows that nearly all this man's tenants were, quote, Negroes, and therefore, as he puts it, no use to me. His assignment from Fortune magazine is to report on the situation of white tenant farmers. Nevertheless, he and Evans do go out to the man's land where the tenants they encounter are indeed black. This is one of them. I don't know which one of the men it is, but this is one of the men. It's actually the first photograph in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. We'll come back to it in a minute. And hence, what is somewhat more striking, the first of the famously agonized encounters that A.G. has with the subjects of the book are not between him and the Gudgers and all the famous farmers, but between him and Walker and three men summoned, he says, three black men to show us what their music is like. Despite the fact, he says, that we had done all we could to try to spare them and ourselves this summons. A book that will be entirely about white people begins then as a book about an encounter with some black people. The black men are, in effect, commanded to perform for the white men. I had been sick, he says, in the knowledge that they felt they were here at our demand. They sing, A.G. gives them 50 cents, and they walk away into the sunlight. What I mean by describing this encounter as agonized, of course, is just that it very much centers on the personal relations A.G. attempts to establish with the people who will be the subjects of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And that it does so because of A.G.'s eagerness to overcome the intimidation or the sense of inferiority that he imagined correctly those subjects, black or white, would experience in dealing with him. Here, as in the only other sustained encounter with black people that A.G. narrates, his approach to a young black couple inadvertently terrorizes them. The guilt, the word he uses actually is self-hatred, he feels, is specifically the guilt of a white man, the guilt of one of the beneficiaries of Jim Crow. But where his efforts to make the terrorized black couple know that he is their, quote, friend, are, even in his own eyes, doomed to failure, the situation is not quite the same with the white tenant farmers, who will eventually say things to him like, I want you and Mr. Walker to know how much we all like you, because you make us feel easy with you. We don't have to act any different from what it comes natural to act. It's just like you as our own people. And to whom A.G. can respond, I wanted her to know how much I liked them, and that I certainly felt they were my own people. The difference between black and white here could hardly be more pronounced. Where Emma Woods tells A.G. that he and Walker make us feel so easy with you, it's like you are our own people, the leader of the black musicians just accepts his money, thanks him in, quote, a dead voice, and refuses to look him in the eye. And the black couple responds to his advances by retreating, he says, even more profoundly behind their faces. Shared whiteness seems to allow for a possibility of reciprocal identification, our own people, that the difference between black and white does not. If then there are no black tenant farmers represented in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, if there are no photographs of black people in the book, it's not just because the assignment from Fortune was to focus on whites. It's also because the black people who do appear in the book are understood to do so in a way that proclaims their unwillingness to be there, and that, more strikingly, is imagined as successfully removing them from it. Thus, for example, the retreat of the black couple further and further behind their faces suggests that even if there were photographs of their faces in the book, there wouldn't be any photographs of them, since they are imagined as behind their faces. And it's not just that black people resist being represented. It's that their refusal to make themselves available to whites is regarded by A.G. as admirable, while its converse is regarded by him as contemptible. Comparing the black singers who treat him and Evans as if they weren't there to the Mitchell's Christian singers, he contrasts the austerity of their harmony, the Mitchell Christian singers, to the mellow and euphonious Fisk quartet style. But the difference here is not just one of style. In fact, in his journals, he criticizes the Fisk Jubilee singers for having abandoned their style, for having shifted over, he says, their style into effects. Everything in their music, he says, is devoted to pleasing a benevolent white audience in its idea of what Negro music should be. By contrast, this is just more white guys. By contrast, there's not an ounce of effect in the Christian singers. They are, he says, absorbed. And I'm going to give you a chance to hear. These are the Fisk Jubilee singers. He hated them. You'll recognize the song. This is what he liked. All right, so the first ones, the Fisk singers, he hated because they were in effect producing effects for white people. This one, these he liked because they were a version of the black singers on this land. Thus, the refusal of the singers in the book to acknowledge the appreciation of the white audience, exactly the opposite of the Fisk's Jubilee singers. Indeed, their refusal even to acknowledge that they are performing for an audience is the mark both of the seriousness of their art and of their irrelevance to Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. We might say that black people in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men are essentially invisible, almost literally unphotographable. Heading out to the white man's land, Evan asks him if it's all right to make pictures, and is told you can take all the snaps you've a mind to, but only if you can keep the people from running off when they see a camera. And the landlord's primitivizing characterization of black people's resistance to the camera is in a certain sense endorsed by A.G. in his own account of the failure of white people to resist it. Because, A.G. writes, white people are much slower to catch on than Negroes, who understand the meaning of a camera, a weapon, a stealer of images and souls. Walker made a picture of this. That's this one. A.G. writes, you didn't know, you thought he was still testing around. The Ricketts, that's the picture of them, are more easily fooled, more undefended, A.G. calls them, than black people. And Evans made this picture, which you've already seen, the day they first met Ricketts, Gudger, and Fields, even more surreptitiously, not by pretending still to be setting up, but by appearing to point the camera in an entirely different direction. He had a right-angle lens attached to his 35mm camera, which made it possible for him to take pictures of people while it looked like he was taking pictures of something else off to the side, a device he'd used off and on since the early 1930s. And a couple of years later, in 1938, Evans would begin his famous subway portraits, this time concealing what he was doing by concealing the camera itself. He painted the shiny chrome parts flat black, and he wore it underneath his overcoat with its lens peeking out between two buttons, and with the shutter rigged to a cable release, the slender cord snaking down his sleeve and into the palm of his right hand. So I could be taking pictures of you like that, okay? Some version, when I first read about this, I just thought, well, so one guy did it, then two guys. It turns out like everybody did it. So some version of this was surprisingly widespread at the period. I just found this photograph the other day and sent it on, and Maggie was good enough to get it on here. So, so if you look, see in the mirror, in the window, so that's Benn, the artist and photographer. So Ben, you can see exactly how this thing works, right? So Benn looks to these poor guys, especially the guy whose tobacco is real, talk about undefended. He looks like he's taking a picture down the street, right? But of course, what he's actually taking a picture of is these two guys who've been immortalized in a way that none of us would like to be immortalized. All right. But so this is sort of the mechanism. And Evans did this. Sean was a major figure, but not a photographer like Evans, but as I say, it was widespread. But the great precedent for Evans was Paul Strand, whose impact on him, as Mia Feynman points out, was enormous. When in the late 1920s he first saw Strand's Blind, he remarked years later, "That really charged me. That's the thing to do," he told himself. The way Feynman characterizes this impact is to say that Strand provided Evans with a model of portraiture as direct and unsentimental. And that's certainly, at least to some extent, true. But Blind, of course, does more than that. Where Strand took most of his street photographs surreptitiously, using a false lens as a decoy, we've already seen a version of that, Blind provides the photographer with a subject who does not need to be deceived in order to be caught unaware. And even though the whole point of the sign she's wearing is to get passers-by to look at her, this only emphasizes what really matters, her unawareness of the camera. What the photographer wants here is someone who is not posing or performing for the camera, whose effort to produce an effect, she is after all begging, is not an effort to produce an effect on the photographer. To put the point this way is to first connect what Evans admired and emulated in Strand's work with what Agee praised in the Negro musicians, who even when they are performing, remember he says, are absorbed in their music and unwilling to acknowledge the presence of an audience. And second, it's to connect both Agee and Evans with a more fundamental problematic in the history of modern art, the relation of the painted or photographed subject to the painter or photographer. The goal of what Michael Fried has characterized as the absorptive or anti-theatrical tradition of modern art has been to overcome the pose. In painting, this has often involved the depiction of people engaged in activities that render them unaware of the fact that they're being observed. Reading is a kind of classic example. Photography, however, radicalizes this goal because it literalizes it. In a painting like this as Gerhard Richter's Reading, there is, on the one hand, no chance that the model, his wife, really is unaware of the fact that she's being painted. Her absorption is itself a kind of performance, not an absolute refusal of performance. But at the same time, because it's a painting, there's no real necessity for there to be a model. The painter can depict an absorbed young woman not only without the young woman really being absorbed, but obviously without there being any young woman at all. So the problem of her awareness need not be solved or even raised. The painter does not have to paint what he sees. With a photograph, however, the situation is obviously different. You cannot do without the literal presence of the photographed subject, and you can at least sometimes photograph people without their being aware of it. Strand's and Evans' efforts to do this thus mark their allegiance to an ideal of absorption, and more fundamentally, their commitment to the idea that what Fried originally described as a theme in painting should in photography be understood as a condition of the medium. Because the photograph requires a subject who can perform, the task of the photograph or the photographer must be to overcome or neutralize that performance. For Agee, this goal had a powerful as well as an aesthetic component. What he admires about the black singers is their refusal to perform, their refusal to interest themselves in the effect their singing has on an audience, as opposed to the Fisk Jubilee guys. And his dislike of performance was by no means limited to singing. Evans claimed once to have seen him furious with, indeed to have seen him assault a woman, quote, because he believed she had faked an orgasm. In photography, unlike in sex, one way to avoid the fake, that is, to avoid the pose, is, as we've already seen, to conceal your activity from the people who are its objects. The idea here is to make the performance for the photographer impossible by making the photographer as photographer invisible. But there are other ways of defeating the theatricality of the pose. The contemporary German photographer Thomas Struth has expressed his admiration for the great ability of his German predecessor and Evans' contemporary, August Sander, not to deceive his subjects, but to enlist their aid. Sander's portraits, Struth says, were only possible not because he made himself invisible to the people he photographed, but through the particular way he interacted with them. I'll leave this up for a second. The particular way he interacted with them, not just seeking to put them at their ease, but as much as possible to engage the sitters as collaborators in the making of the portrait. And if you contrast Strand's Blind, which you see on one side, to Saunders' Children Born Blind, made in 1930, just after Evans first saw the Strand, one can see an element of collaboration. Looking at these children, we feel not that they are unaware of the camera. In fact, because Saunders used a big and relatively slow camera, there's no possibility they were unaware that he's taking their pictures. He has had to ask them to hold the pose for a few seconds. But not exactly that they're performing for it either. And this ontological comfort in front of the camera, they're not trying to look a certain way to their audience, in part because they cannot even, their children born blind, look a certain way to themselves, is psychologized and intensified in Strout's own portraits, where the sense of collaborative ease is instantly visible. But not in Evans's portraits. Evans did not collaborate with the tenant farmers, and he was not their friend. Actually, they disliked him. Years later, Margaret Ricketts would remember, quote, he didn't talk with them, he didn't even talk down to them. And she would complain about, quote, his indifference to them as people, and his obvious loathing for the way they lived. In fact, her sharpest memory of the photographs he took involved not collaborating with him, but resisting him. In this photograph, according to Margaret, her sister Paralee, well, you can see which one she's going to be, rebelled by keeping her eyes closed while the picture of their family was being made. So she's trying to spoil the picture. If then Agee's aesthetic required the kind of indifference to the effect of their performance embodied in the Black Singers, and Evans's aesthetic required not just an indifference to the effect of performance, but the elimination of performance as such, this is just what they did not get, and let us now praise famous men. The farmers are, to use two of Agee's favorite words from the period, self-conscious instead of self-absorbed. Furthermore, and this is the point where the demands of photography as a medium and the personalities of the photographers as artists begin to take on a certain social meaning, the self-consciousness of the farmers is also something more than personal. It's not just the self-consciousness of the subject in front of the camera, it's the self-consciousness of the poor in front of the comparatively rich. This point is made by Margaret Ricketts' remark about Evans's loathing for the way the farmers lived, and the family's resentment of the way in which they were represented by Agee and Evans is expressed in interviews with other members as well. George Gudger's son, for example, describes his father as, quote, angry because his family was cast in a light that they couldn't do any better. They were doomed. They were ignorant. What they didn't like, in other words, was not just that the camera made them feel self-conscious, but that it made them feel inferior. It's this feeling that Agee, whom the farmers actually liked as much as they disliked Evans, tried with his very real personal charm to dispel. Agee, Evans said, had a great gift of making people not only like but love him. But it's one thing to make people like you. It's another not to feel superior to them and not to make them feel that you feel superior to them. And it's yet another not actually to be superior to them. Indeed, what let us now praise famous men's interest in the relation between the photographer and the subject photograph dramatizes is precisely this difference. It's what Agee called the cold absorption of Evans's camera that represents a social difference that Agee's warmth, his Saunders-like ability to collaborate with his subjects, to establish a relation with them, cannot elide. The fear he imagines for Mrs. Ricketts, standing naked in front of the cold absorption of the camera and all your shame and pitiableness to be pried into and laughed at, that fear cannot be allayed by the assurance of his care for her, his insistence that you should not fear us, you should not hate us, we are your friends. Not because this assurance isn't sincere, but because it's irrelevant. Indeed, it's because this difference between the photographers and their subjects has nothing to do with their feelings. It was not produced by enmity, and it cannot be overcome by friendship, that in these photographs it is underlined rather than erased. The point can be put more strongly, perhaps, by saying that the photographs are primarily photographs of this difference, a fact that was a problem for Agee and has continued to be one for admirers of the book. It has arisen as a problem primarily, however, not because, as Sadie Ricketts feared, people find the tenant farmers pitiable. On the contrary, compassion is the more or less appropriate ethical response, but rather because we find the pictures of them beautiful. In Tom Mitchell's words, if we take, for example, a super famous picture of Annie Mae Gudger, as a quote, Mitchell says, a purely formal study of flatness and worn, graven surfaces. Isn't there, Mitchell asks, and he's saying something here that many, many writers on these topics have said, isn't there something deeply disturbing, even disagreeable, about this unavoidable aestheticizing response to what is, after all, a real person in desperately impoverished circumstances? Why, he asks, should we have a right to look on this woman and find her fatigue, pain, and anxiety beautiful? More generally, and apart from the question of rights, what is the meaning of a photographic practice that, as Walter Benjamin complained about the new objectivity in 1934, 2 years before this photograph was made, succeeds in transforming even abject poverty into an object of enjoyment? A photography that, confronted with tenement blocks, refuse heaps, cable factories, says only, like the 1928 New Objectivist collection, the world is beautiful. And more generally still, what does it mean to seek out the misery of the Gudgers and the others, and as Agee puts it, to use these lives not for journalism, not for political propaganda, but for art? Agee's formulation here, use these lives for art, helps us put the question in a usefully precise way by suggesting that the problem is not so much about the possibility of taking aesthetic pleasure in these photographs as it is about the question of who can take that pleasure, and about his doubts that the Gudgers and the Ricketts could. It's not just, for example, that the family snapshots on the Ricketts' walls don't look like art in the way that Evans's picture of them does. It's that it wouldn't matter even if they did. Sometime in the 1970s, Margaret Ricketts was given two of Evans's photographs, one of her father and one of her mother, as we can see in this picture that Michael Williamson took in 1987. No one who has read anything about the Ricketts is likely to think that these two photographs function for her as art. More generally, insofar as there is at least some truth to Bourdieu's 1965 claim that, quote, the realization of the artistic intention is particularly difficult in photography because fundamentally, he said, it's only with difficulty that photography can escape the functions to which it owes its existence, by which he means like taking pictures of the people in your family. We can see the difference between the family photos tacked to the wall, which exemplify one of what he thought of as its founding functions, and the Evanses hung on it, which don't exemplify that function, are not likely to be understood in the aesthetic register. Indeed, the ambition of the Evans, the claim to an interest that transcends the interest one has in pictures of people one knows, is invisible to the subjects themselves. What Margaret Ricketts is putting on her wall is pictures of her mother and father, not works of art by Walker Evans. And if to be skeptical about these people's ability to see Evans's photographs as art is to sound condescending, and whenever I've taught this text, the one thing that everybody objects to is what they take to be its condescension. And the whole point of this talk today is to not only defend that condescension, but to argue that it is the sort of political, radical political core of the text. If to be skeptical about these people's ability to see Evans's photographs as art is to sound condescending, the tenant farmers, Agee claimed, have no sense of beauty. That condescension, they can't see the beauty in these pictures, but we can, is just the flip side of Benjamin's accusation. After all, only the rich see the beauty of poverty. But it would be a mistake to conclude from this fact that the beauty of these pictures therefore compromises their political meaning. On the contrary, it's what gives them their political meaning. It's only if you can see the photographs as art that you can see the superiority, that's Agee's word, of the person who made them and of the people who admire them to the people who are in them. Now, Agee used that word always trying to make himself not seem superior. But the issue here is what it means not to seem superior, but as I said a little earlier, to be superior. It's only as works of art, their beauty invisible to their subjects, that they inscribe on themselves the inequality that is the condition of their production. It's only, we might say, as works of art that they can speak to our subject for this series, the meaning of revolution. We can get a better understanding of how by comparing Let Us Now Praise Famous Men to the photographic project of the period that Benjamin most admired, Saunders' People of the 20th Century. Saunders' ambition was, as he put it, sociological. Face of Our Time, which was the only part that was published in his lifetime in 1929, contained a sample of the work. The complete work, as Benjamin said, comprises 7 groups which correspond to the existing social order. These groups are the farmer, the skilled tradesman, the woman, classes and professions, the artist, the city, and the last people. One way to begin to describe the difference between Sander and Agee and Evans then would be to note while there are many, in theory, all classes of society represented in Sander, and Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, there is just one, the tenant farmers. But this, as we've already begun to see, isn't quite right, since there are at least 2 class positions that matter in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, the class of the people being photographed and the class of the photographer, and of course of the intended viewers who can see them as art of the photographs. Which is just to say that the structural difference between the photographer and his subject, structural because it's built into every photograph, is here, and here also structural, since it's built into the ambition to make these photographs art, a social difference. That's in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, photographs are in effect explicitly defined as photographs of poor people by and for richer people. In the Sander, by contrast, with its ambition to represent the entire social order, the relation between the photographer and his subjects is structural, but the social difference between them is not. Why? Precisely because in Sander the point is to represent all classes, all of society. Thus, for example, people of the 20th century necessarily includes people who belong to the same class as the photographer. And indeed, as it happens, alongside portraits of farmers and lawyers, etc., it includes a representative photographer, Sander himself. Between Sander, the photographer who takes the picture, and Sander, the photographer whose picture is taken, and then placed in a volume called The City, between barmen and bohemians, there is no inequality. The difference between the class position of the photographer and his subjects is thus made structurally irrelevant or only anecdotally or biographically relevant. Since all classes are represented, it is, in other words, necessarily the case that the photographer will belong to the same class as some of the people he photographs and to a class that is different from all the others. And both this difference and this identity are thus rendered incidental. So the structural drama of the Agee and Evans, the drama of the way in which each photograph negotiates the problem of what it means for some people to be, whether or not they are happy to be, above, again that's Agee's word, some other people, is irrelevant in Sander. In fact, there's an important sense in which the question of superiority is irrelevant not only to the relation between photographer and subject in Sander, but also to Sander's understanding of society itself. Michael Jennings describes this well when he says that Sander, quote, declines to attribute mastery or superiority to one segment of society over another. Whereas you could say Agee and Evans are insisting on attributing it to one segment over another. The relation between different groups in Sander is crucial in that they each form part of a whole, the social itself. And if some are higher and some are lower, their relative positions represent a kind of hierarchy rather than an essential conflict. What I mean by this is that there is no implied relation in Sander to an egalitarian ideal, an ideal that would, in Evans and Agee, be violated by the making of the photograph itself. The relation in Sander is rather to an ideal of inclusiveness, one that would be violated by leaving someone out. Hence, the photographs function to make sure that everyone is assigned a place, that no one is left out. And although accounts of the politics of Sander's project differ, the one thing everyone agrees on is that Category 7, the last people, is meant to include those whom the Nazis were increasingly committed to excluding. But Sander doesn't just find a place in the social order for those, the Jews, the blind, the insane, whose position in it was threatened. He also finds a place for those who are committed to destroying it. Hence, revolutionaries, who might plausibly be thought of as enemies of society, occupy in Sander a place within it. In Face of Our Time, they are photo number 25. 23 is Odd Job Man. 24 is Communist Leader. 26 is Working Students. And 27 is the Herbal Medicine Expert. So you got your revolutionaries, you got your medicine expert. The way Jennings puts this is to say that Sander is sympathetic to every member of society, a characterization that is, on the one hand, a little implausible. What can it mean to say that Sander is as sympathetic to this SS captain as he is to his son, who was in a Nazi prison when this picture was taken, that is the picture of the captain, who died in that prison in the following year, and whose death mask is the final photograph in the work. So it's hard to think of him as sympathetic to that SS captain. On the other hand, the captain was so pleased with this portrait that he ordered 50 copies to be given as Christmas presents to his friends. The best way to understand Sander's sympathy here is the way to understand Evans's lack of it. It's structural rather than, or sometimes as well as, personal. That is, the ability to interact with his subjects that Strout praises in Sander is the ability to locate them all within a social order that includes both the SS and the people the SS tortured and murdered. It is that order that is his true subject, and the acknowledgement of the position that every class should have within it that is the politics of his aesthetic. For Evans and Agee, however, the problem is not that the tenant farmers have been excluded from society, which is why what I earlier called Agee's Sander-like efforts to include them, identifying them as his own people, striving to and even succeeding at becoming their friend, function only to mark their irrelevance, the irrelevance of friendship, the irrelevance of a people. And Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, exclusion from society is not the problem, inclusion in it is not the solution. Essentially, in Evans and Agee, there's no such thing as society, or rather their vision of what there is absolutely not sociological. What I mean by this is that the relations of superiority and inferiority, which in Sander are subsumed by the larger whole, are in Evans and Agee everything. Agee's romantic and easily criticized characterization of the artist as, quote, a deadly enemy of society makes a kind of analytic sense here, since the role played by art in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is the reduction of society to nothing but inequality. The poor in Agee and Evans do not, as they do in, say, Caldwell and Burke White's, Erskine Caldwell and Margaret Burke White's, contemporary and infinitely more popular at the time, You've Seen Their Faces of 1937. They don't, as the poor in Caldwell and Burke White, have a distinctly regional identity. They're Southern. Region does not matter, I'm arguing, to Agee and Evans. The first words of Caldwell's text, and Caldwell was, of course, a famous Southern writer of a certain kind. Anybody here ever read? When I was a kid, there was a paperback copy of Tobacco Road lying around. And it was the kind of thing that if you were like an 11-year-old boy, you went straight to page, I don't remember what the page number was, but it was like white trash behaving badly in a very alluring way to the average 11-year-old boy. So it's kind of these kind of kitsch, pornographic, but quite skillfully done visions of rural life. The South, he calls it the South's questionable culture. Now, of course, we have like institutes devoted to studying it and trying to, in fact, preserve it. But the difference between Agee and Evans and their poor has nothing to do with either geography or culture. It's not about their being Southern. Rather, insofar as it's something that we might think of as cultural difference appears in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, it does so, as we already saw at the very start, only to disappear. It's embodied in the black singers, right? And thus removed from representation by their resolute and hyperbolic anti-theatricality, the indifference to their effect, the effect their music has on white people. makes them invisible. The exclusion of the Negro, to use his term, from Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, is thus the exclusion also and crucially of the question of cultural difference and cultural authenticity, of what it means to perform for whites or for oneself. And there is, of course, no effort in this book to represent the activities of the poor whites as the function of Southern or rural or working class cultural difference. No banjos, no folk songs, no outsider art. They are, to use his word, damaged, not different. They are in need not of a sympathetic anthropologist, which is what the academic world has been giving them for the last half century, but A.G. says, I'm quoting A.G. here, of a good revolutionist. Most obviously, neither regionally nor culturally different, the tenant farmers are also not racially different. They do not, as they do in another important contemporary photographic text, Richard Wright's 12 Million Black Voices, belong to a persecuted race. And because the damage done to them is not the damage done by racism, which Wright called in that text a paradoxical amalgam of love and cruelty, that damage is set aside by Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. You can feel its effect. It helps make possible A.G.'s claim to belong to the same people as the tenant farmers. And it's part of what it makes it possible for him and the farmers both to feel that they, quote, liked each other. But racial antipathy is just as irrelevant as racial solidarity is. Just as the affection you feel for your own people, and that you can, if you're as charming as A.G., get them to feel for you, does not mitigate the difference between you. The lack of affection, more precisely the amalgam of love and cruelty you might express in your actions toward people who are not your own, does not cause the difference between you. And Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, black people are excluded so that race and racism can be excluded. What thus emerges as central in A.G. and Evans is inequality without racism. Inequality, the effective life of which is complicated by the fact that the inequality is not itself an effect of affect. The poverty of the Gudgers is not a consequence of hatred. That's why A.G.'s desperate and successful efforts to like and be liked by them functions in the text only to display its irrelevance. This is also why Evans's loathing for their way of life is not quite similarly irrelevant. It marks the existence of a gap that would not be overcome even if the loathing disappeared, even if Evans were more like A.G. or Sander. There's something deeply impersonal about it, not effective, not impersonal. It's like when A.G. passed to Alabama the following summer, sort of coming to the end. He was traveling with his wife-to-be, Alma Mailman, and they stopped at the Gudgers. So they're driving up from New Orleans, and they just pull off the road into like the hill country and go visit the Gudgers. They didn't text ahead. But they show up, and the Gudgers, A.G. wrote, were happy and amazed to see him. And actually, that's probably true. Lots of people who criticized A.G. for sort of like feeling that he was successful in making people like him. But when you read the interviews with him, and it's kind of cottage industry, every sort of 10 years or so, someone goes down and interviews survivors. They all say, actually, they did totally like A.G. So when he shows up, they're happy to see him. And they fed them dinner. A.G. stuffed himself. And if you've read the book, there's a very, very famous scene about A.G.'s relation to eating there, which I won't go into here. Alma, however, and I'm quoting now from the biography, Alma went outside and vomited what she had eaten. To paraphrase a remark Robert Smithson once made about Michael Fried, the quality of Alma's disgust is high. It's not an expression of her dislike of poor whites. It's not an expression of her inability to tolerate cultural, here in the form of culinary, difference. If there's one thing Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is clear about, it's that the relevant difference between A.G. and Evans on the one hand and the Gudgers and the Ricketts on the other is not cultural. Again, that's part of what's insisted upon by the expulsion of black people. That's the point of insisting on the difference of class. Rather, because her disgust is neither personal nor cultural, it acknowledges a difference that can only, or that should only, be understood as inferiority. And what Alma acknowledges is what the photographs assert. It is the aesthetic fact of their beauty, a beauty not available to, quote, the appallingly damaged group of human beings who are their subjects, that makes visible the social fact and the distinctive social character of the differences between the white men who made the book and the white men, women, and children who are in the book, a difference that racial and/or cultural understanding cannot bridge, that it takes an artist to show, but that it would need a revolutionist to efface. Thank you. So if we kept on going, if we're doing a longer thing and had done Faulkner, the whole point of the Faulkner would have been to do a little reading first of Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, one passage in it, and then of Toni Morrison. And I just kind of thing you find on the internet, you know. So someone has morphed in this kind of not successful, but really appropriately creepy way, Toni Morrison and William Faulkner into the same figure. And indeed, they are the same. And just so you know how it comes out, in my reading, they get it wrong. They're both wrong. They're both on the wrong side of this. They're both completely into what actually Richard Wright himself was not. That is the amalgam of love and cruelty that is racism. Wright was not a greater author than writer than Faulkner. Faulkner was certainly a great writer, but Wright had a lot better politics and a lot cleverer sense of relationing his politics and aesthetics than Faulkner did. So we have time for some questions, right? Absolutely. So feel free. Yes?
I need to talk in the microphone so it gets recorded. Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'll wait for the microphone.
I'm going to stand over here, so I'm going to blind about light.
Okay. First of all, thank you for your talk. It was very thought-provoking. I'm wondering to what extent in your studies you've considered the FSA, you know, the Farm Security Administration, and the kind of fraught relationship that Walker Evans had with Roy Stryker, and the commissioning of you know, a team of photographers to go out and photograph, you know, America and the plight of the poor, the tenant farmers, and to what extent that has bearing on your thesis.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has. I certainly thought about it and, you know, read lots about it, but I think it has real but limited bearing. I mean, part of the bearing would be just that, you know, Evans was much more resistant to the sort of political kind of commitments that that were being pushed on the FSA, and that kind of works for me, because really my point here is that Faulkner, you know, I don't know why I'm doing Faulkner. Evans had no political commitments at all. I mean, he just had zero political interests. And part of the point, whereas A.G. was in the period sort of a Marxist. So part of the point I'm making really is that it's the function of his aesthetic that produces the politics. So yeah, it'd be slightly awkward for me, in other words, if what Walker Evans had been saying was, I told you when I get out there and like show these people to America and get us all to start feeling differently about them and sort of take some action, then I'm sure I would have stuck to my guns and said this anyway, but I would have taken a little more longer footnotes to explain away the things he said. But as it happens, it takes no footnotes at all, because the things he said were like, I hate it when people put political meaning into my work. I have no politics. I don't care about politics. So yeah, it is kind of relevant, but in this kind of, for me, attractively negative way.
I think his track is, you know, he's on track as an artist.
Absolutely.
That was clear from...
It's clear right from the start that Walker Evans was one of the first people, if not the first person, to have a kind of coherent modernist idea of what it meant to be an artist as a photographer. By which I don't mean, of course, there weren't lots of great photographers before him. I mean, I think today, if you ask people I'm doing a lot of work on contemporary photography, if you ask contemporary photographers today who the sort of great photographers are in the past, I think the names Ache and Sander come up over and over again. And neither Ache, it's not what actually Ache thought he was doing as a source of ongoing debate. Sander did not think of himself as an artist exactly in the way that Evans did, for sure. I mean, his characterization is always sociological. That's part of what's important here. On the other hand, no one can see these photographs, you know, without recognizing the man was like a, you know, completely, overwhelmingly important photographer. I've been working with this photograph, just sort of thinking about it, just having it around, trying to work, as I've worked on this material off and on now for a year and a half, 2 years. And you know, it's like an amazing photograph. I mean, Blind, right, is an amazing photograph. But actually, compared to Blind, and they're different, obviously, and Paul Strand is a completely major figure, but, you know, my friend Michael Fried always says if you put two paintings on the wall, one kills the other. So it's a bad way to do when you're doing this, but if you put these two photographs together, Sander kills Paul Strand. So I'm going to leave it up there so you have a little bit of death action. A little bit of violence, you know, for our revolution. Yeah, there were hands up from the ground.
I liked where you came out at the end, and I agree with that. I worked at Fortune magazine in the 70s, and I actually had James Agee's desk for a while. So
really?
People would come back and tell me stories about this. And, you know, the regime of the art director is enormously strong at Time Inc., and especially at Fortune magazine, where art directors not only sat in our story meetings, but told us to write paragraphs to go with the pictures. And Margaret Burke-White was the other staff photographer. And when I reread this book after working at Time Inc. for a couple of years, it seems so clear to me that it was a reflection of Time Inc. editorial policies, and particularly the photographs.
Let us now praise famous men was, or the Burke-White?
Both of them. Walker Evans and Margaret Burke-White were staff photographers.
I can't agree with that. I mean, say why.
Well,
the Burke-White's obvious. Say why you think the Let Us Now Praise Famous Men.
They both treat people as objects, and because they came out of a regime of photographing industrial objects and headquarters and corporate executives.
That's true. I can't agree with that. It's interesting to say.
So, but my bigger question is, why you haven't considered the originary culture. The magazine assignment came from Fortune as part of the evolving aesthetic.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Let me say the first part, the sort of like easy and true answer, and then say maybe a more exaggerated one, methodological one. The true one is that this was never published in Fortune, and actually Fortune took away, well, but they even didn't do the little version, and Fortune, Agee had asked to be able to name his own photographer. Fortune had no interest at that moment in Evans, but they let Agee do Evans. And Evans had zero interest in the aesthetic of Fortune. Not true of Burke-White. And if you've read Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, you know that if there was one photographer that James Agee had complete, total contempt for, it was Margaret Burke-White. Exaggerated. You know, completely exaggerated, and in many respects unfair, not totally unfair. So the first thing I would say is that I think that there's a way in which it's not true that, so there's a kind of relation by negation again to the Fortune culture. The second thing I would say is that, you know, I'm not a, you know, I'm going to say this as if we're just kind of like my own personal view, but I actually think in general, I'm very much, I don't actually think it usually, how to put this? I just think American studies was a bad idea in the first place. I was just writing to a student of this, and that the effort to sort of like do the history of American art in the context of American studies just, I'm looking for a word that's not sucks, but sucks is what I keep on coming back to. So my own impulse is not to sort of like look at those institutional structures, except one was actually required to. And it doesn't mean that they aren't, you know, in a certain sense relevant. And sometimes they're very, very relevant. You know, you can imagine contexts in which. So for example, for Sander, it sort of is very relevant that where he was working, that he was a portrait photographer, and what it meant for him to escape portrait photography. But for Evans, it's just not. Evans has a certain vision of what modernist photography is. He's going to invent modernist photography. He does invent it. It's important to see the context in which he does it. Agee has a much more sort of across the map version of this. And Agee, of course, as we know, would come to live happily ever after with Luce, essentially by giving all this up and writing, you know, the famous movie stuff forever, which also, I should say, I find like much less interesting. I mean, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is how many people here have read this book? Be honest. How many people here have not read it? Virtually everybody. So like it's really discouraging. You should read Let Us Now Praise Famous Men if you actually have any knowledge of American literature. It's one of the probably, I don't know, 9 or 10 most important texts of the first half of the 20th century. It's a very, very powerful book. And A.G. in that book was a very great artist. Outside of that book, in my view, A.G. was never a very great artist. He was a kind of like pretty good film reviewer. There's a certain cult around it. His novel was kind of interesting. So for me, it's not so much, I mean, it's kind of a general sense that unless you can find something very, very concrete that's going to work for you, I actually just don't think the American studies sort of like institutional approach is useful. I was thinking of this because I flew here from Paris to Cleveland. It's like 2 different worlds. Cleveland has its upside, though. The hamburgers are like way better. So it was and I was just in conversation with 2 students in Paris, both of whom want to come to America to do their graduate work, and they're sort of interested in coming to my institution because they're interested in my work. But they also then think of themselves interested in American studies more generally, and they're applying to American studies programs. And one of these guys has applied to Yale and been admitted to the Yale American Studies program. And I said to him, hey man, if you go there, I give you up. It's just like sort of saying, I'm going to have a lobotomy, you know. And I didn't know they did lobotomies anymore, but they do. Yale American Studies is the place for it. And then when I come out of it, I'm just going to like live in that world. So yeah. If anybody here, by the way, got his or her PhD at Yale American Studies, you know, you got to take your chances. That's the way it goes.
So, yeah, well, I thought that was fantastic. I wanted to ask you about the claim. I'm really interested in this claim that art and that beauty can provide this, you know, social analytic function, right? And it strikes me that one of the famous things about social class is that so often it's invisible, right? It requires, that's why you need economics, right? Because it's not instantly visible in a modern society. And so it strikes me that what's really distinctive about Let's Now Praise Famous Men and about your account of it is that those farmers are like so abjectly below like the photographers that anyone who could see it would say, sort of like anyone who owns a camera, right, is above these people, right? And you know, a term I'm not sure that's still used anymore was underclass at one point, right? Someone that a group of people that is sort of below the capitalist class structure. Obviously, there's different accounts of that. So my question is this possible? In other words, is the visibility of class a sort of constraint on the ability of photographs to represent social structure?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's why it's better to go to Johns Hopkins to study than go to Yale. Although at least used to be, it's not anymore so much. Yeah, so look, I mean, there are 2 things. One is, yeah, it's easier. 2 is I don't think it, and there's a question about whether it's fundamental or not. I mean, the first thing would be is that one wants to get, it's not actually impossible to take even abject poverty and to turn it into a culture. That is, if you look around and try to read things on Alabama in the 20s and 30s now, I assure you, many things you will find on precisely these people will represent them in sort of a different light and will represent them precisely as having a distinctive culture of their own. It will acknowledge that along with the distinctive culture, they had like, you know, their teeth fell out when they were 21, and they had little things crawling up inside them from the time they were 14, and that they all died at 38. It will acknowledge all that, but what's interested in is their culture. So, but I take the first point, which is that there is a kind of very visible class difference. And I think that is important. It's not clear to me, you know, underclass would be a kind of problematic term. Underclass, the sociology of the underclass really is a kind of essentially conservative sociology. William Julius Wilson would be the sort of main progenitor of it now, basically focusing on African Americans. Much and brilliantly combated recently by Ken Warren in an issue of Critical Inquiry, which around The Wire. William Julius Wilson did his reading of The Wire, and Ken Warren did his reading of The Wire, and it's like, beyond Thunderdome, 2 men enter, 1 man leaves, right? So, sort of like the photograph thing. And the part of it is that the force of the underclass thing is precisely to say these people are excluded. It's that's the effort to try to treat them as if they belong to what Sonder would have called the last people. Their problem is they're not brought up into capitalism. If you could just get them into capitalism, then it wouldn't be the same problem. So everybody sort of see the logic? That's actually a really important point, although I hadn't thought of it this way, you just did now. Because the point would be here, two things. First of all, these guys are working for a living. There are people making a profit off what they do, right? Guys who, they're tenant farmers. What does it mean to be a sharecropper tenant farmer? It means that you're working for the guy who owns that land. He's got the money, so he's making money. And those guys weren't getting rich off what the Gudgers were doing, but they were part of an economy. Second of all, and this is, I think, maybe the more crucial point, you know, this whole, the whole notion of the underclass is part of a discourse of class which has become extremely, in a way, central to American political life in the last 30 or 40 years. The great sort of advocator of it politically was Reagan. What's the idea? The idea is that there are people, the French version for it, I've been working with a guy in France who works on this there, is the surnuméraire. That is, surnuméraire, people who are, the other version is, in the American version, is kind of precarity, people the precarious, the precaria. People who really aren't part of the economy and who therefore don't belong to the working class. But you know, it's not that hard to see that actually the structure of the working class totally includes these people. I mean, what is it? The largest job in America today, the job that most people have, that the most people have, not most people have it, but it's the job that the largest number of people have, is salesperson, retail sales. Does anybody here know what the average salary for a retail salesperson in the US is? Anybody want to take a shot? Nobody ever worked sales? Man, Case Western Reserve, you guys are really like high class. It's like what you all do in your, what are your summer jobs? We're all just interning for whatever. So $12 an hour right now is what they make, okay? $12 an hour is not really a living wage. You've got $12 an hour doing this. Why do retail salespeople make $12 an hour? Why don't they make like $15 an hour or $18 an hour? They make $12 an hour because there are a whole bunch of people who have no jobs at all who, if they won't work for $12 an hour, this person will work for $12 an hour. Right? In other words, the labor market. It's like Milton Friedman said long ago, and Marx said it before Milton Friedman. The labor market is defined by the surnuméraire. You're going to have people who actually are not currently in the labor market. Actually, it's wrong to say even that way. They're in the labor market. They're just not succeeding in the labor market. You got to have them. So if you start to divide the world up between the working class, who are in capitalism, and the underclass, or these guys, not these guys, but the other guys, who are not in capitalism, you're actually making, it seems to me that's a kind of fundamental theoretical error, right? That they are all part of the structure of the working class. It's only these guys who are not working, right, who make it possible for these guys who are working to work for what they work for. They're all part, so no one is outside of capitalism. Capitalism needs unemployment in the same way. I mean, I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's a structural thing. You need unemployed people.
Yeah, but none of that is visible, right? And the relation between the kinds of people that are sort of theatrically abject.
Yeah, you can't make it as visible today in the same way. And that's why if I had a different I don't have it. If I had a different PowerPoint here, but you're going to be in Atlanta, the way, if you're going to do like a version of this today, there are no people in the picture. If anybody's got, like they're doing internet right this second, you just write this down, look up a German photographer called Victoria Binstock, B-I-N-S-C-H-T-O-K. Look up her series of photographs. It's called The Absence of the Present, The Absence of the Present, or The Absence of the something, I can't remember what it is now. And it's a series of photographs taken in German German unemployment offices 5 years ago, and there's no one in them. You can see a sense of it. Sonder published Face of Our Time in 1929. In 1929, when he put it together, I think in 28, the German unemployment rate was like about 8.6%. In 29, it had gone up to 14%. In 30, it went up to about 40%. And no, 30 went up to about 31%. And in 31, it was up to like almost half the population, 44%. Sonder gave a series of radio broadcasts in 1931. And this is where I'm sort of agreeing with you. In the radio broadcast, he said in one of them, if you could just have a photographer in every one of the 365, I don't know why that number is, but his number, not mine, it's like not leap year, 365 unemployment offices in Germany today, you would have a picture, right, of the tragedy that has overcome our nation. So his vision of this was you needed to see these people. It's the essentially sociological vision. That is, these are the people who are our society now. They have this role in society. But back in my book in 1929, there's only one unemployed guy. He's the last guy, but only one. If you're going to do all the different classes of German society now, there'd have to be like more unemployed, just proportionally. But, right, if you think about unemployment properly, and think about it now, some years later, you want to say the point of unemployment is not to sympathize with the unemployed. If you are a salesperson making $12 an hour, when you look across the street at an unemployed person, you do two things, right? One is you're sorry for the person who's unemployed. The other is, if you're thinking, as it were, economically, what are you thinking? You're thinking, if it weren't for all those people like that, I'd be making more than $12 an hour. There'd be a little inflationary pressure on wages of labor. So your relation to this person is at best ambivalent. And if it's not ambivalent, you are in what Sartre would have called bad faith, right? Because you're not recognizing that this person, while to be pitied, of course, also plays a role in what is, after all, it's your impoverishment. You're working, remember, for $12 an hour, okay? So the point, really, of the binge talk is that to understand the position of the unemployed today, of those, as it were, at the bottom, is not to see their faces at all. It's to see them as, well, Marx's word for them was the pivot on which the market, the labor market, hinges. And that would be more accurate. So yeah, totally right, though. It's totally right in the end of that. Now you don't have to listen to me to Lan at all, because there's about 3 pages on that.
I was very interested in the whole aesthetic of inclusion with the Sonder. Yeah. Now, you've written very well on the tendency to use the rhetoric of inclusion and diversity to turn issues of economics into culture. And so I see the thing that says everybody fits in with everything, and having read you, I'm very suspicious. Now, what I wanted to ask you is, what we've got in the Evans is something that is the thing that says, that isn't talking about inclusion. Now, and I don't know a lot about the history. Is that to what extent, is it a rejection of inclusion? Is it not simply not taking the inclusion path? What is the prehistory of the rhetoric of sort of inclusion, we all fit in together, all the parts work together, and we don't have to talk about the economic. What is it? Yeah, I'm sorry.
I think I see the question. I mean, I'm not sure that everybody, I'm trying to be clear to everybody else in this. So if you've read a bunch of my sort of political work, especially, like The Trouble with Diversity, which must be an important book because it got me into Hustler magazine. If you've read The Trouble with Diversity, one of the central arguments of The Trouble with Diversity is that, in fact, we define inequality precisely in terms of groups in which the central problem, the structural form, is going to be some form of essentially discrimination, understood in various ways, failures of appreciation. And the way to deal with that is precisely by ending racism, ending sexism, ending homophobia. And that is a discourse of inclusion. And what a class discourse is very different because, just to put it as simply as humanly possible, people are not poor because of our failure to appreciate them. They're poor because of capitalism, not because of our affective relation to them. So that's a kind of quick, dirty version of this. Question then is like where, and you're obviously right, that is, how I got interested in this in the first place, in a certain sense, was part of all just being struck by the power of the combination of the text and photographs, and let us now praise famous men, and by the claim to art, that is, by the obsessive interest in art, and by the fact that that art accompanied this rhetoric of discourse of inequality and of anti-exclusion. It's against Sonder, you begin to see that sort of our contemporary version, our inclusion discourse, really, I think, is a stage in the development of a much older discourse, which was inclusive but not egalitarian in the way that sort of Sonder is. That is a vision of a society in which everybody, a fundamentally conservative vision. You have a fundamentally, and it's today, anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia are, in my view, completely conservative, by which I mean right-wing commitments. Okay? And the argument here would be, not the kind of logical argument about that one, but in their origin, that in fact you've always had a kind of conservative discourse which required not that people in a given society be as it were, economically equal as possible, but rather that people respected others. So for example, in the UK, throughout the first half of the 20th century, and surprisingly, actually now, we're coming back sort of, as it were, from the left, you have a long tradition of Tories sort of saying, it's outrageous to abuse the poor. It's outrageous to treat the poor with contempt. It's outrageous not to respect the important place that the working class, rather than the poor, has in British society. And the interesting thing today, of course, is that the people who say that tend to be still on the right, but more and more on the left. That is, people who think that the problem of being poor is that you are indeed a victim of disrespect, that people treat you with contempt, that people treat you with the wrong kind of affect. So you have a kind of conversion of a left and right discourse, although in my view it's actually just an extension. It's the way the right does the right now. It makes this into a kind of question of inclusion. And the whole point of the question of inclusion is to say, I mean, here's the ways to put it. It's not as if the working class is excluded from capitalism. On the contrary, you don't have capitalism without the working class. And in the extended version that I was describing before. So you want to say, the minute you get a discourse of inclusion and exclusion, it's not that it can't be important and do good work, is that whatever it is, it's not anti-capitalist. So the whole point for us is that the absolute dominance in our social life today, our political life, of the discourses of inclusion and exclusion is precisely a mark of the way in which they are not in any sense anti-capitalist, that there is no anti-capitalist US left, whether Marxist or some other form. There is only ways of doing sort of a right-wing politics in the US in the form of trying to include everybody. So I don't know, that didn't come out quite as clear as I meant it to. I have actually a good, if you stay around afterwards, I can try again. But you got the basic idea. So no one wants to rise to the bait of like why racism is, anti-racism is right-wing. Everybody's tired. We good?
We've been talking a lot about visibility, and in your talk, the concept of performativity and performative effects came up a lot. And I was wondering if there isn't another modernist who's kind of the photographic negative to what you're talking about here, and that is Brecht, who was interested, obviously, in making visible class consciousness and social classes through, it seems to me, a very, not absolutely opposite, but dialectically opposite way to the way that you've sketched out here. I was just wondering if you could comment on that a little bit. Yeah,
it's funny because my wife, Jennifer Ashton, is like here too, because she's has to give a talk in Atlanta, and she is actually back at our hotel writing that talk right now on Brecht and precisely this question. So I realize that's not an answer. She hasn't let me, and she hasn't let me read it. Yeah, you got the wrong talk. Yeah, Brecht is kind of, I mean, the best thing to say is that that's a totally smart question. It's like totally on target. How to think, and the two things would be, right, and precisely the way you put it. One is Brecht looks like the opposite, because Brecht is completely interested, after all, in a certain kind of production of precisely performance. So the question is whether it's oppositional or dialectical. So the correct answer ought to be dialectical. The question is how that comes out. But for me, here's one way to put how it's worth it, and how you can see they come together. So actually the book that this will be a part of, that I'm trying to finish while I'm on leave this semester, is called The Beauty of a Social Problem. That actually is a phrase from Brecht. And it's a phrase from Brecht in the notes, performance notes to Mother Courage. So Weigel has performed Mother Courage, and Brecht writes, he's writing the performance notes, and he says, the great thing about Weigel's performance, especially when it's one of the songs toward the end, it's the song of capitulation, when she convinces the lieutenant to withdraw his grievance, and then she withdraws hers, and they both go home. And he says, if the actress allows the audience to identify with mother courage at that moment, everything's wrecked. You lose the beauty of a social problem. So there's a question of what it's being used for. Absolutely, it is the case that there what you want is something like, but it's going to look not so different then from Evans, right? Because you can get identification here, right? You totally can get identification here. But I don't think, you can lie and say you do. Well, anybody who identifies there, see me after class. But, I don't think you're going to get a lot of identification there. I don't think that's part of what's being produced in these photographs. So, and I know that's not part of what's being produced in that photograph. So this one will be more kind of complicated because of its iconic relation to the culture. But so I totally take your point. There are important differences. But if there are two different ways, in effect, of producing the difference between the people who are performing the work and the people who are its subjects on the one side and the people who are, in effect, its objects on the other, it's two different ways of, in effect, doing a version of the same thing. So that would be the kind of dialectical version of it. And for me, it's important. The Brecht thing, when I read the Brecht thing, what made it work for me so completely was obviously you could see sort of what he was going for. But it was not that you miss the social problem. It was that you missed the beauty of the social problem. In other words, it's not as if the point of the art is to then get you to the social problem. It's as if the art's claim to beauty is itself inextricably linked to the social problem. So you can't sort of disarticulate them and tease them out. You can't say one's about the other or one's cause is the other. And that, I think, is really true in Brecht and very powerfully true in the Evans. So for me, the point of this book is like to find examples of the way in which a complete commitment to producing powerful works of art. And beauty is a word, beauty is a word that's kind of complicated. People don't often use that in the aesthetic. Like, for example, Fried, with whom I obviously have a great deal in common, But Michael almost never uses the word beauty in his work. But in the guys I'm writing about, beauty is actually very important. Not because they have a good concept of beauty, but because beauty marks for them a certain claim to the aesthetic. And they don't have any politics at all without that claim to the aesthetic. Otherwise, they just have like their views, which are whatever their views are. But yeah, you're totally right. Yeah. Okay, we can talk after we do this. Thank you very much.